Hello, this is the second of three talks on Black people and the trade unions. Each one should last about 10 minutes, and the idea is to see why race is a trade union issue, something that affects not just Black people, but also white trade unionists as well. And I want to start, well, firstly with I think about definitions. I'm going to be using Black as in the wider sense to mean people who come from colonized backgrounds. So this will include people from African, Caribbean backgrounds, but also people from a number of Asian backgrounds. Now, this was the way that the term developed in terms of Black sections or Black trade union groups or so on in the 1970s and 1980s. And I think in practical terms, it's useful, even though it's less used these days. Another thing about looking back at the past and some of the periods I've been looking at will use terminology which would not be acceptable these days. So for instance, the use of the terms coloured and Negro. These were considered polite terms at the time, so you will see them in some of the documents I refer to. So I want to start by just reminding you that the first talk I did was about how Black people have been part of trade unions as long as there have been trade unions. Final one will look at how the trade union movement is at the moment and how people are drawn together in it. But here I want to look at the situation of white workers and reasons why they object to Black people and why they object to people working together in trade unions. There's been a feeling sometimes that racism is something that affects Black people and therefore has nothing to do with white people. And I think that this is something that can be a problem for a number of reasons. In the 1950s, as you had local councils, the health service, some companies advertising across the Commonwealth or sometimes the British Empire as it was still known at the time, for immigrant workers to come because there was a booming economy and a serious labour shortage. Some trade unions opposed this and they argued that they argued a number of things. Some argued a crude racist position that you didn't want to work with Black people. Others argued a slightly more sophisticated position, which said that if you invited Black people in, they were used to lower wages and therefore would work for lower wages and would undercut the existing price for the job. To which the fairly obvious response, and one which has been used again and again, is that if you recruit them to the union and make them welcome, then they will want to have the same wages as other people do. And this kind of uncertainty was something which certainly managements in various firms preyed on, so that particularly, for instance, in northern mill towns, many companies would try and take immigrant workers, often from Indian or Pakistani backgrounds, and put them on different shifts from white workers, so that you'd have one shift that was all immigrant and one that was all white. And then it was possible to set one against the other and say, we can't give, for instance, the white workers a wage increase because the non-white workers are prepared to work for less. And you saw in a number of workplaces, and I referred to this in the first talk, a tension between white and Black people, where Black people on the whole had to force their way into the union to demand that they should be part of the higher wages that went along with that, which rather contradicts the original idea of Black people undercutting wages. But this idea, and it's something that comes back again and again, is challenging racism, is challenging the ability to divide and rule the workforce. I want to come back again to something else that I talked about in the last talk, which was the Bristol bus boycott in 1963, when Black workers led a boycott of the Bristol bus company, which at the time was not employing any Black people. The reason that the company gave for not allowing Black people into the company was that they didn't want that they could recruit local white workers and that the trade union supported them. This was the case. The local Transport and General Workers Union was supporting the idea of a colour bar, and There's a link at the end to a film about this on YouTube, where you can hear interviews with some of the white workers at the time, putting forward a range of reasons why they didn't want to work with black workers. Some of them familiar from what I've just been saying, that is, they would undercut wages, or they'd work too hard, or that there wouldn't be enough work for everyone, so people would get sacked, white workers would get sacked. And then you have the more crudely racist things, such as saying that women workers couldn't work with black workers at night because they wouldn't be safe, this sort of thing. I should say that at the end of this dispute, the anti-racist side won. Black people were employed on the buses, and this didn't undermine the conditions of white workers, far from it. But it's interesting, this was also, in a way, a precursor to the Race Relations Act. It was partly during that dispute that Harold Wilson, at the time, before he'd become Prime Minister, started discussing the necessity of developing a Race Relations Act. And that was a law that said it was now illegal to discriminate against people on racial grounds, which meant that you could not now put up a sign or say to someone, I'm not employing you because you're black, or put up a, if you're renting a room, put up a thing saying no blacks, no Irish, this sort of thing. Now, people should be well aware that that didn't stop discrimination in work or in housing, but it made it less overt and made it harder for people to justify the kind of arguments that they were putting forward. So this is something which has changed through the years. There were more crudely racist confrontations, such as that came after Enoch Powell's racist Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, when he said that the problems that British workers were having were down to the immigration of non-white workers, and several groups of workers, mostly notably people who felt that they were under threat, who felt that their union organisation was under threat, particularly dockers who were in a difficult position at that time, and in this case, as pictured here, some meat porters from Smithfield Meat Market marched on Parliament to support Enoch Powell and took strike action. Interestingly, there's two things to say about this. One is that Enoch Powell had never shown any particular support for workers in the past, and that as they felt more confident later on, for instance, the dockers came back to support the Grunwick strike, which I talked about last time, about a decade later. It's also the case that, talking in 1968, Enoch Powell said that it didn't matter if black people were born in Britain, they would not be British, that there was something about being British that was different from the experience of black people. And I think this is important, because this relates to ideas of what it is to be British, and these are ideas which are coming up again at the moment. I'm just going to skip through to the 1980s, to an adverts that were put by the Conservatives in the immigrant background press to try and get people to vote Conservative. And the slogan you can see here is Labour says he's black, Tories say he's British. This was not a successful campaign, though it was run by the most powerful and successful agents in the country. But the idea that what it was suggesting was either you're black or you're British, and you can't be both, you've got to choose, was something which most black people just didn't identify with. They were saying, why can't I be black and British? Why can't I keep this identity and expand on it? And this was something that led eventually the Conservatives to retreat on, particularly because they didn't get extra votes for the money they paid for these adverts. But also it meant that they started talking about the idea of being black and British. But this is something which has continually been a questioned issue. So if you come to the beginning of the recession in 2009, so just after the financial crash, you saw in a slogan being taken up in some construction sites and some oil refineries saying British jobs for British workers. And what the argument was, well, it started from something that had been a slogan, a racist slogan by the National Front in the 1970s. The slogan was revived in a way by the then Prime Minister, the Labour Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, who said that we had to develop British jobs for British workers. Now, he was saying we needed to develop more British jobs for everyone who lived in Britain. but the slogan was taken up by many people who felt they were under threat by immigrant workers, and therefore it was seen in a racist light. And unsurprisingly, I think the fascist British National Party took it up, so that you can see on this election leaflet, they've used the slogan to try and draw people in for themselves. And this, I think, was of no benefit to the workers in construction sites, or indeed the workers in oil refineries. Excuse me. And where these people were successful, where they defended their conditions, it was precisely by saying, let the other workers, let workers from other bits of Europe, or immigrant workers, black workers, or whatever, come into the union, and therefore we will all have the same conditions, and therefore you defend the rights in the job. And I think that this is one of the basic lessons of trade unionism. I'm going to leave it here and say that next time I will be talking about the current trade union movement, why race remains a trade union issue, and why communities from immigrant backgrounds are central to the current trade union movement, things that we've seen through the experience of COVID and so on. In the meantime, I hope that some of these publications will be of interest to people who've picked up some of the ideas I've been talking about in this talk. So thanks for listening, and I hope you will want to hear the last talk. So goodbye.